All right, welcome back. Next up, Tim Curlis, Chief Architect at Ahead and one of our leading thinkers on the topic of DevOps. Tim's going to talk about how we can go about scaling the delivery of software, delivering better software faster through a concept called environments on demand. Then he'll be joined afterwards by Mike Colano for Mission 3, choosing the right container orchestration platform. Enjoy these sessions. Please ask questions, and then we'll wrap for day one. Tim?
So first of all, why are we here? Organizations want to build better software faster. That's been the whole ethos of the DevOps movement. And we found that through a bunch of research, higher performing organizations achieve that business value sooner. And we're going to talk about what it takes to become that high performing organization so that developers get to focus on solving problems, not preparing environments, copying data, and doing busy work, which in effect should improve employee retention and hiring and positively impact just the DevOps organization and differentiate your organization in the marketplace. And really the ultimate goal being to hopefully delight our end users with new features and drive customer acquisition and happiness in this crazy digital world we're in that demands that competitive, fast-paced nature. And so, again, through some research done by Dr. Nicole Forsgren and her crew, we found that where code deployments are most painful, you'll find the poorest software delivery performance, organizational performance, and culture. So we're going to talk about how to improve that and how we can make everyone happier and more productive. So some of the symptoms of stalled DevOps movement, we see this a lot in our customer base. Most organizations can identify with one, if not a bunch of these. But some of the most critical ones, certainly the fear of failure based on past implementations going poorly. So a common one there being Agile. Sometimes the adoption of Agile is so painful and goes so poorly that people hear about DevOps and some of these new movements and they just don't even want to try. In other cases, it can be the hair on fire effect, which is all of my people are spending all of their time just keeping the wheels on, putting out fires and containing problems, fixing bugs, that sort of thing. And it just doesn't leave any time for innovation or DevOps movement. It could be a lack of defined success criteria. Again, typically because you're moving so fast, you just don't have the capability to stop and say, here's what we need to focus on. And certainly culture, and that can come down to siloed and lack of communication issues, as well as just, again, the lack of a leadership that kind of says, hey, this is our focus, this is our North Star. We want to change the way we've been doing things so that we can become more efficient. And then certainly along the bottom, just more tactical things like we don't have any version control, or maybe we have too many version control systems. Too many of our processes are manual, which is a large focus of the presentation today. And certainly issues with security and aligning with security so that we positively affect that part of the business. And in essence, we still see this at all of our customers for the most part. You may be in the cloud, but you're still doing this, passing the order form around where somebody needs something. And there may be pockets of automation, but in essence, these teams hand us requests back and forth, in some cases even with email, in other cases with a ticketing system like ServiceNow. But basically the time spent doing this handoff is what really slows down the overall process. And we find through some work by Mick Kirsten in his book that this provisioning process has a number of stages that contribute to this overall increase in time. And so the request comes in and we have this issue of having to prioritize what gets worked on. And with this lack of visualization and things like that, it can become more and more challenging to prioritize this work across the organization. Once the effort is picked up and is worked on, there's this kind of as to the previous slide, the back and forth between teams. So the active time represents a team taking hold of that ticket and doing their part, maybe creating a set of VMs, maybe creating a load balancer, that sort of thing. And then there's this waiting time as the request is emailed or handed off to these other teams. And this repeats several times before the environment is delivered. And what we've certainly found as an average, it can be 20, 25 days, even as high as 40 days to create this environment before coding can begin. And in many cases, we have to remember that once the environment's created, then the developer has this responsibility to install all of their tools, perhaps some middleware, copying code bases and test data and that sort of thing. And so usually the 20 to 25 days isn't the whole story. It can go on beyond that. And so this is the current challenge. If I'm a developer and I need a fresh environment, I've got this request ticket potentially to put in. It goes into this ticketing platform and generates this, what you saw a few slides ago, where the ticket is handed across a bunch of teams, and there may be some automation that's improving and coming along, but this automation isn't connected across the different teams and across the business value. So eventually, 20 and 25 days perhaps later, we've provisioned this new development environment. Conversely, if it's something that's so daunting, I perhaps just decide to use the existing environment. Then I run into this issue where I've got years of overlapping changes and stale data in the test environments and the dev environments, because in many cases, the amount of effort to create these environments means that they live for 5, perhaps 7 years with periodic refreshes that really creates a long-term kind of crufty layer that sits on top of this. And so we're going to talk about how to really figure out how to combat this with a bunch more automation and a bunch more self-service. So first is to gain consensus amongst the teams. This means bringing the teams together in a workshop-based approach and trying to understand what is it we're trying to build, and giving everyone a chance to voice their needs, their use cases, their concerns. And again, you want to strive to build something that is minimally viable. It may not hit everyone's use cases because frankly, that's almost impossible, but it should be an effective use of everyone's, it should effectively meet everyone's use cases as best you can, so that you can get started and get moving without continuing to, sort of go through the analysis by paralysis. We want to make it easy and easy to use both for requesters and also to maintain that automation on the back end, so that people aren't focusing all of their time on taking care of these environments, but hopefully getting more and more time to drive innovation. You want to include security, plan for security. It's very important so that, again, it's the whole movement of shifting security left so that we don't come up with something at the end and then have to go back and rework. We want to include security in this consensus gathering and design phase. We want to automate relentlessly so that we're focused on push button get environments and there's automation throughout rather than have to wait again for the ticket or the email, to help with prioritization and continue through that. So this workshop-based approach, it involves taking a week or whatever, and sort of pausing, but it also is very important in terms of building something that's going to be effective for all of the users and the key stakeholders. And so again, as we found in the Accelerate book, a good culture requires trust and cooperation between people across the organization so that it reflects the level of collaboration and trust inside the organization. And this, again, is something that by bringing those groups together, you can really foster that trust and get started off on the right foot. And speaking, further about culture, we've got the Ron Westrom in his research with the Westrom organizational culture has really shown the 3 different archetypes, including pathological, bureaucratic, and generative. And what you'll see here is sort of a few characteristics, certainly not all of them, but representations of what we find in customers with these types of philosophies. And for the most part, there's no customer that fits into one single column. It's typically a blend. And I would say customers are trending more in the bureaucratic to even generative in some cases. But certainly we want to sort of take a pause and take stock in what our performance is, because, as we found, this leads to better organizational performance, which results in better software delivery. And I do like how Adam Jacobs says it, that your org structure isn't solving a problem. It's an artifact of how you've solved it before. So in other words, if we want to change the mold here, we need to change our communication and our organizational structure slightly. And then secondly, once we've sort of looked at the culture, let's create the process that everyone agrees is necessary for our outcomes. So again, if I'm a developer, I need a way to get a new environment. That could be through a self-service catalog. It could be an API request. And then from there, there's an automation engine pictured here, Azure DevOps, but something that takes and goes through all of the steps necessary to create this environment. Such that I don't have to have a team or an individual set of folks manually get in there and punch the keyboard to get this created. And so the steps we want to agree on, certainly this is just an example, but you want to understand what are these steps at a high level, and then sort of try to figure what is the best way to accomplish these steps and what tooling should be responsible for each. So it could start off with creating a new Azure DevOps project, perhaps creating a new Git repository, setting up static analysis, dynamic analysis for code scanning and artifact scanning. Perhaps this is a cloud native containers project, so we're going to create a registry. We're going to create a Kubernetes cluster. We're going to clone out some test automation as a starting point, and we're going to maybe perhaps set up some collaboration through Microsoft Teams or Slack, and even some monitoring services with something like App Dynamics or Datadog. And at the end of this, we have this full development environment ready such that the developer can plug in their editing tool of choice and they can just get started writing code with this boilerplate. And so we're building something delightful, hopefully. So this is an example of some of the catalog request forms that a developer might use in the case of our automation hub. So they may decide, hey, I need to, such as our company often does, I need to create this React front end on a JavaScript backend, and maybe I need a Mongo database. So I've got some fields on this form, nothing too exhaustive, but some things that I can fill out and affect the environment a little bit, but keep it very straightforward to request. I align it to a business reason and perhaps a cost center of whose resources this is going to come out of, whose budget, and then I hit the submit button. And hopefully, with in the case of a standard request, this doesn't even require a tacit approval. It can simply be an automated approval. Perhaps if it's a larger project, then it goes through a larger approval process, but that should be more of the exception. And so this kicks off a process to maybe get again, this Java stack or this Node.js stack on perhaps a Kubernetes cluster. And this is created in 30 to 60 minutes. So again, we want to define the tool chain that goes through and creates that automation. And the tool chain should be considered minimally viable to start with. And certainly we don't want to force it. There are always going to be folks that decide they need something else for their use case. And then there's also just the aspect of time. And so what we decide on today may not be the tool chain in a year or 2 years or whatever it is. So we like to look at the tool chain as being a product in and of itself, meaning we have a product team that supports our tool chain, whatever that looks like. They're responsible for training. They're responsible for the product roadmap. They're responsible for the operational support and the training around this system. And then off to the side, we can have this area for experimentation and effort and choice that lets people decide, hey, I've found this new tool out here that meets my needs. Perhaps it's a new data, AI, and ML project that we're doing. And the existing tool chain is really missing a part that can handle that. So we have an experimentation and choice area with some best effort guidance. It doesn't have that full enterprise support yet, but it allows us to test with a common infrastructure platform security model, and then provide, through some approved mechanism, provide some feedback to that enterprise product team so that they can support this, and ratify this into the tool chain if it makes sense to do so. So this product-based tool chain is a very powerful methodology for making these innovative decisions and also managing and supporting these going forward. And the solution we're going to go over here step by step begins again with a request process, and we're going to talk about staging that pipeline through a series of templates and then into some automation, which brings it all together. And then ultimately wrap up by explaining how everything as code really helps us deliver these things with more automation and more of the leading edge and innovative design approaches such as GitOps. And what we're ultimately building, this again is an example of a commit-driven application stack. So this is essentially the purple being kind of a self-service catalog-based or API-based pipeline that says I need a new environment. And then through a series of automation and templating, the blue is that environment. And so the user is provided their stack, their infrastructure, whether it's in the cloud or on-prem, maybe Kubernetes or a series of VMs. And then there's a templated tool chain in the blue there that helps them with the build, test, and release, and other steps, of course, in there. And then that sort of becomes their own, and they can take that as a starting point, but they can add to that and morph that as they go forward. And ultimately, this deploys the application stack to that infrastructure. And then we've also tied in with the enterprise tooling in terms of monitoring. Perhaps we've deployed some Prometheus dashboards or something like Datadog that allows us to plug into an enterprise framework that we have from a monitoring perspective. And there's probably a bunch of other tools that are in there as well. But the point is we've plugged everything in here in a standard approach using automation. So step one is the request. Again, this developer decides they need a fresh dev environment for the project they're working on. So they're going to make either a UI catalog-based or an API request, depending on how complex the request is and perhaps how frequent. Certainly if this is something they do once a sprint or every couple of sprints, the catalog approach is not too onerous. If it's something they do for testing several times a day, then it's probably going to be done via an API call in their pipeline. What you see here, ServiceNow ends up being kind of the catalog, and even if it's an API request, it's a API request to the ServiceNow API that builds this in a shopping cart fashion and just plugs in all of the information, automatically through that API request. And again, to that point, one thing we have to recognize is that it's more than just human requests. It's not necessarily only about going into this portal and filling out a series of forms and having to arduously click through. Again, that might be fine if it's once a month or something, or every couple of weeks. But if I'm testing and committing and doing full CI/CD, I probably need some of those same capabilities delivered via API requests. So they're more frequent actions. They're more about deploying services, and they're fully automated. And again, it needs to use the same tool chain, but it needs to be a different form of interacting with that. And then the third form, certainly that we're seeing more of these days, would be self-healing, where you have a tool like Datadog or AppDynamics that says, hey, I've determined there's an issue in this environment. I know I can take some corrective action. That looks and feels a lot like the similar automation to create the environment. So rather than have engineers creating duplicate workflows that really do the same thing, it's how can we have this library of workflows and plug into that in again, the manual way, the API-driven way, and the self-healing way. And for step two, it's all about staging this pipeline. So this serves as this starting point, but it needs to remain flexible going forward. So perhaps providing them a getting started point for CI/CD. Maybe the application is built and the artifact is placed in a common repository that we've created. There's a series of test automation scripts that exist for all of these applications, and then a standard release approach. And really, this is geared at getting people started as quickly as possible. It sort of forks off from these templates at the point they create their environment. So they get some sense of individuality, but their maintenance is handled by sort of these baseline templates that we can collectively keep one template in one spot up to date. And then the environments that we create off of that will be, in effect, always up to date based on if they're new or not. And we like to incorporate these starting points. Some of the ones out there that certainly we see a lot, Spring Initializer for the Spring framework, JHipster, another popular one. Something like Create React App if you're doing React development. And there's many other ones in Ruby and .NET and whatever you happen to be using. But essentially, you take that as a great starting point. Many of these also have APIs, which allows us to drive the creation of these environments through a standardized template via an API call. Pull down a zip, and it allows us to extract that into this repository that we've just created for the purpose of this application test environment. And then we pair with it specific organization settings. So the things that we need, perhaps we have a bevy of Java settings that we use for all of our Java apps. We put those in. Maybe we want to copy some test data for this common platform that we use and our developers could benefit from as a getting started point. But the point is you're pairing up a sort of common framework that somebody else has done, and you don't want to reinvent that wheel, with some specific organizational data and specifics, for your teams to get going quickly here. So step three is all about the automation. And what you see here is the ops environment being kind of the templated beginning point, forking off and spawning this development environment that becomes the developers to have and maintain. So at the beginning, these look very similar. And from then on, they can start adding their own code. They can perhaps tweak the pipeline a little bit if they want to change how things are built or deployed. But the point is we have this ops environment that has these pipelines as code themselves. And as a request comes into something like ServiceNow, we can initiate this sort of grandparent pipeline that goes ahead and creates these development environments. And from there, again, they become their own at that point. They are copied into a new code repository. And if the developer decides they need to add steps, test steps, release steps, whatever, they can do that without impacting the pristine starting point environment. And conversely, if the organization decides as a whole we want to change a step, we can do that on the left, and everything will propagate through, or at least when new environments are created. And behind the scenes, again, we have these templates. So we may have a template for the application framework. We may have a template for our environment, such as creating things in a CMDB and creating monitoring, setting things up in IP address management, load balancers, and even things like maybe a common starting point for test automation, where all of our React apps or all of our Java apps have these 6 tests that we can provide you to get you going faster. And certainly you can update those as you write code and as you come up with new features. So again, the pipeline itself is created by yet another pipeline that is the environment on demand. And as I've alluded to, we have the ability then to create this sort of catalog of building blocks. So the capabilities themselves are little automation services. And then I basically go through this process of finding out what are my priorities with respect to those, which ones do I want to create first, and I can create a backlog of effort around new little building blocks that I want to create and what order I want to create them in. And every time one gets built, it needs to go through this process of being standardized, having procedures around it, and being written in an automated fashion. And these service capabilities are then added to this framework, and they're maintained by the folks that are expert in them, right? So if this is something that gives me a load balancer, perhaps it's maintained by the network team. If it's something that sets up security scanning in my containers engine and repository, then perhaps it's maintained by the security team. And so these little services can be kept up to date and can be, again, maintained by those that are expert. And everyone, again, this fosters kind of that everyone coming together, breaking down the silos, working together to create this innovative process, and everyone is sharing information more effectively, and it drives us again towards more of that elite DevOps performance. And as we go through this in terms of step 4, we find that everything can be represented and built up as code. So of course we have the application code itself, perhaps some test code, the pipelines, modern tools these days, tools like Harness, tools like Azure, DevOps, tools like CloudBees, Jenkins, these all have YAML representations of their pipelines. So that allows us to create things that work for our business, and for as many of our teams, maybe get them 80% of the way there. So that when we're cloning off these environments on demand, those serve as the starting points. And then the code becomes theirs. So if the last 20%, the team decides they want to add release steps or certain tests, they do that in their code, and none of this is kept within somebody's head. It's kept in the repository as code that teammates can come and learn and go up to speed on, and all of these things. The same thing with release automation code and certainly infrastructure code. So again, as this development environment is created, we're creating the infrastructure that supports that. That is, for example, Terraform code as well, and that code can be updated. It can be modernized as you go and redeployed, and it becomes this living set of infrastructure as code that goes right along with all the other code aspects. And essentially that can get us to this GitOps platform automation approach, where all of these things become self-service because I can update code, I can do a git commit, and then the automation kicks off automatically from there through these orchestration tools, something like Jenkins or Visualize Orchestrator or Terraform. And those make the changes first to the platform or perhaps the application frameworks. And from there, the monitoring systems can look at both and say, something happened last night, I need to kick off this automation to restore service or to increase performance, or any of the things that we designed into this platform. And again, if we just go back to the why, the developer needs this environment. It took 3+ weeks to create this, and generally resulted in a lot of manual effort for different team members and the developer themselves. And if they decided to use the existing dev environments, they probably had years of overlapping changes and stale data. And so the new and improved approach is, I need a fresh environment. I go request it or do an API call, and within minutes, this fully automated service kicks off this new development environment, and it provides the developer with that repo of all of their code, their app code, pipeline, release, test, and infrastructure. And so from there, the code becomes theirs. They can start from this templated starting point, but they can also add to that immediately and just basically get started writing application features within minutes. And the outcomes of this, it should be a roadmapped and phased approach to getting through this process. It shouldn't be a big bang. It shouldn't happen all at once. We should have these well-understood metrics. We need to understand where we're coming from and where we're going so that we can measure that success or failure. And hopefully we'll get more frequent releases. We'll have faster mean time to issue resolution, and really just we'll deliver features faster. That's the ultimate goal, to innovate and delight our customers. And so again, Research has shown automation and improved communication results in elite DevOps performance. So we want to plan, we want to make progress as we go and not do this in a big bang. We want to foster innovation. The business, in effect, will be happier. And really, our teams will be happier, having more meaningful work, and we'll retain talent, we'll hire talent more effectively. And all of this will feed back on each other and continue to help with innovation and provide more business edge and accountability. So with that, hopefully I've shown you some environments on demand, and I'd like to take a few minutes here just for any questions that you might have. Please use the Q&A panel, and we'll go ahead and get started answering your questions. So our first question is, looks like, how do you pick which services to offer first? So in the presentation, we looked a lot at some of the Azure tools, some AKS stuff with Java. The fact is, even as we've done this as sort of a proof of concept, we had to just pick something to get started with because the permutations are pretty extensive. So I guess that what I would say there is, again, going back to the collaboration and workshop approach, you want to try to figure out what it is, most people will benefit from starting off, and start to create a prioritized backlog after that, so that the teams know what they're working on next. And there's this sort of project manager or product manager even that really can help to facilitate, what's the order of operations that we need to address these. And I would say the other piece of it is, what's your business focused on? So if you're focused in lots of data, trading, financials, and maybe you do a lot of stuff with R and Python, for example, the environment on demand might be a research environment. That's one we've seen before, right? Where researchers can get an environment on demand with some data that's either sanitized or appropriate for their study, that's kind of loaded in advance. So it all comes down to kind of the use cases, but these are things that can be sussed out sort of in the process of the workshops and the go forward there. So another question, where does DevOps reside in the IT organization, and how do you balance product priorities with foundational priorities? It's a good question. The first answer to that I always give is leadership. I think DevOps, a lot of times will start as kind of a skunkworks thing. And the question we get often is, how do you scale it? And I think the first aspect of that equation is, how do you get leadership involved in driving some of this, so that they can help facilitate the breakdown of silos and the communication can improve. And of course, to get leadership involved, the number one thing there is to identify the problem you're solving and also align it with the business objectives. How will this help us sell more, widgets? How will this help us, address more of our customers' needs as a bank? Whatever the value stream looks like, it's it's important to identify that rather than just go, hey, we want to do DevOps because Netflix does it. So that's a big piece of it. And I think in terms of where DevOps resides, again, it can sometimes be that skunkworks starting point. But we see sort of this dichotomy right now of, coming out of infrastructure, where it's like, we need container platforms for our developers, and we'll talk about that in the next mission. And then in many other cases, we'll see it come from the application side. And even within applications, it's sometimes this new group that, has come together to start doing DevOps, but they're not necessarily application developers in the lines of business anymore. So again, I think going back to the leadership, aspect to kind of bring that together and create this strategy is really important. Another question, a great question we see a lot: how does this paradigm apply to basically commercial off-the-shelf, third-party software or non-cloud native applications? I'll answer. I think there's two questions in there. First, if it's not cloud native, that's fine. I think in many cases we've in the past kind of looked at these long-term dev environments, and all those really are a series of virtual machines. And, in many cases, we can automate that process. I think the more tricky aspect of that is, how do we get the test data or the relevant data sources sort of staged? So I don't have a silver bullet for that. That's a longer discussion, but I think it can be done. I've seen it be done in some cases. And then I think the other answer to that is in some cases, let's just focus on the newer stuff. And if it's something that's in the legacy that isn't necessarily valued to us going forward, let's focus on the new development, and the cloud native stuff might be there. And that's where we, do some of these automation environments on demand. And again, that comes down to the workshop to decide what are my key use cases and who will I benefit? What's my minimally viable approach here? And then in terms of third party, commercial off the shelf software, I think we're starting to come into this point where vendors are more and more going to give us some of these cloud native applications as containers, similar how about, 12, 15 years ago, they started giving us VMs. These are things that they're doing, and they're going to expect or hope that we can, take advantage of some of those efficiencies by running those. And I think having these automated environments that say, hey, I've got an SAP environment, HANA's a great example, where I want to do some testing. Let's have this orchestration to create this test environment for those types of apps. So just, again, it turns into less of a development problem and more of an integrations problem. But I think some of the automation we've seen and developed there has been pretty similar. So moral of that story is just because they're commercial off the shelf apps doesn't mean this doesn't apply. It just changes, again, perhaps those use cases and the priorities for what you build and when. So I see I see a couple questions around just getting slides and presentation. That'll all be facilitated, of course. So look for that in the follow-ups that are sent out. And I think time for one more here. The last question I see, at least right now, is what if my developers want to use APIs instead of a catalog? So I hit on this. I think there are cases where asking a development team to continuously fill out this form is really cumbersome. So I sort of look at it as this creation of a service notion where I might do that only every month, every couple of weeks, maybe aligned with a sprint, and I need an environment just for that. I think asking teams to sort of fill out a short request form every couple of weeks is reasonable. But certainly the interesting thing that we stress for sure is all of these automation systems should be API driven and really declarative as code. So as we're stitching all of these things together, we should create these automation workflows that frankly can be called whether I'm filling out a form or if I'm just making an API call because of a commit. So it's really important in the design process to factor both of those approaches in. And as I kind of covered, people want to access things in different ways, but we don't want to reinvent the wheel each time. So we want to make that automation repeatable for those different approaches. It looks like that's about all we have for questions, and then I think takes us nicely to our next mission. So we'll be back in just a moment. We're going to dive into our next mission for this afternoon, and thank you from Mission 2.